Good morning everyone. My name is Jimmy G. Artus Jr. and I am assigned to discuss my topic regarding the MUTANAE, its anatomy and dogmatic principles, together with Ma'am Risa Bullion. So today's report I will be discussing to you about the dogmatic principle of fingerprint. So first, what a fingerprint is. So fingerprint is a reproduction of some smooth surface of the hand formed by the ridges and furrow. A fingerprint is the impression made by the ridges on the inside of the first joint of the finger or thumb on any surface through the medium of sweats, inks, or any ingredients capable of producing visibility. As a means of personal identification, its scope is embraced under the science of dactylography and its four allied subjects, namely. So first, dactyloscopy. It is the science of fingerprint. It derived from the words dactyl, which means finger, and scopien, which means examine. Dactyloscopy is the procedure of personal identification based on the study and examination of the patterns that form arcs, loops, whorls on the fingertips of the palms of the hands and soles of the feet as the method. Saporoscopy. So it's the study of pores of sweat glands in the papillary ridges of epidermis. So number of pores, their size, shape, and site in a given length of a ridge, individualistic. Saporoscopy is the scientific examination or study of the sweat pores. It is the study of the configuration, size, and relative position of the pores in human skin, which are the external openings of the sebaceous and sweat glands. Together with dactyloscopy and palm print identification, it is used in criminalistic for purposes of identification. It also involves a comparative study of the pores visible in impressions left at the site of a crime and in the fingerprints of an identified person. It is performed when the impression left with the skin is not suitable for dactyloscopy. Next is the gyroscopy. So gyroscopy deals with the study of the print of the palm of hands. And Sir William J. Herschel is known as the father of gyroscopy. Gyroscopy is the scientific examination or study of the palms of the hands. The palm of a hand is covered by minute ridges of skin called papillary or friction ridges, separated by depressions known as pores. Podoscopy. It is the scientific examination or study of the soles of the feet, a term coined by Wentworth and Wilder as a possible word, if ever needed, referring to the study of the soles. Polydactylism. It is the appearance of extra fingers as anatomically known. Dactylography. It is the art of fingerprint recording for identification purposes. Friction ridge. It is raised strips of the skin on the inside of the end joints of the fingers and thumbs by which fingerprints are made. It is sometimes called papillary ridge or epidermal ridges. Pores. It is a tiny holes of the skin where sweat and other secretion may come out. Next is the historical accounts, person, and dates to remember. Nearly 1000 to 2000 BC, fingerprints were used on clay tablets for business transactions in ancient Babylon. In 3rd century BC, thumbprints began to be used in clay cells in China to sign documents. In 610 to 907 AD, during the Tang Dynasty, time when Imperial China was one of the most powerful and wealthy regions of the world, fingerprints are reportedly used on official documents. In 1686, at the University of Bologna in Italy, a professor of anatomy named Marsilio Malpighi notes the common characteristics of spirals, loops, and ridges in fingerprints, using the newly invented microscope for his studies. In time, a 1.88 mm thick layer of skin, the Malpighi layer, was named after him. Although Malpighi was likely the first to document types of fingerprints, the value of fingerprints as identification tools was never mentioned in his writings. Professor Johannes A. Purkinje, also known as the father of dactyloscopy. In 1823, a thesis is published by Johannes Evangelista Purkinje, professor of anatomy with the University of Breslau, Prussia. The thesis details a full 9 different fingerprint patterns. That's what we call transverse curve, central longitudinal stria, oblique stripe, oblique loop, almond whorl, spiral whorl, ellipse whorl, circle, and double whorl. Still, like Malpighi, no mention is made of fingerprints as an individual identification method. Sir William Herschel, in 1858, the chief magistrate of the Holy District of Jongimpur, India, Sir William Herschel first used fingerprints to sign contracts with native Indians. In July of 1858, a local businessman named Rajdhar Punai put his handprint on the back of a contract at Herschel's request. Herschel was not motivated by the need to prove personal identity. Rather, his motivation was to simply frighten out of all thought of repudiating his signature, as the locals felt more bound to a contract through his personal contact than if it was just signed, as did the ancient Babylonians and Chinese. Herschel adopted the practice permanently. Later, only the prints of the right index and middle fingers were required on contracts. In time, after viewing a number of fingerprints, Herschel noticed that no two prints were exactly alike, and he observed that even in widespread use, the fingerprints could be used for personal identification purposes. Dr. Henry Faulds. In 1880, Dr. Henry Faulds, a British surgeon and superintendent of Chokiji Hospital in Tokyo, published an article in the scientific journal Nature. He discussed fingerprints as a means of personal identification and the use of printer's ink as a method for obtaining such fingerprints. Faulds had begun his study of what we call skin phoros. During the 1870s, after looking at fingerprints on pieces of old clay pottery, he is also credited with the first fingerprint identification. A greasy print left by a laboratory worker on a bottle of alcohol. Soon, Faulds began to recognize that the distinctive patterns on fingers held great promise as a means of individual identification, and developed a classification system for recording these ink impressions. Also in 1880, Faulds sent a description of his fingerprint classification system to Sir Charles Darwin. Darwin, aging and in poor health, declined to assist Dr. Faulds in further study of fingerprints, but forwarded the information on to his cousin, British scientist Sir Francis Galton. Sir Francis Galton. In 1888, Sir Francis Galton began his study of fingerprints during the 1880s, primarily to develop a tool for determining genetic history and hereditary traits. Through a careful study of the work of Faulds, which he learned of through his cousin Sir Charles Darwin, as well as his examinations of fingerprints collected by Sir William Herschel, Galton became the first to provide scientific evidence that no two fingerprints are exactly the same, and that prints remain the same throughout a person's lifetime. He calculated that the odds of finding two identical fingerprints were 1 in 64 billion. In 1892, Galton's book Fingerprint is published, first of its kind. In the book, Galton detailed the first classification system of fingerprints. He identified three types, that is the loop, whirl, and arc, of characteristic for fingerprints, also known as minutia. These characteristics are to an extent still in use today, often referred to as Galton's details. In 1892, Juan Bisotec, an Argentine police official, had recently begun keeping the first fingerprint files based on Galton's details. History was made that year when Bisotec made the first criminal fingerprint identification. A woman named Rojas had murdered her two sons, then cut her own throat to deflect blame from himself. Rojas left a bloody print on a doorpost. After investigators matched the crime scene print to that of the accused, Rojas confessed. Bisotec eventually developed his own system of classification and published a book entitled Dactyloscopia Comparada, or Comparative Fingerprinting, in 1904, detailing the Bisotec system, still the most used system in Latin America. Sir Richard Edward Henry, the father of fingerprint as a means of personal identification. In 1896, British official Sir Edward Richard Henry had been living in Bengal and was looking to use a system similar to that Herschel's to eliminate problems with his jurisdiction. After visiting Sir Francis Galton in England, Henry returned to Bengal and instituted a fingerprinting program for all prisoners. By July of 1896, Henry wrote in a report that the classification limitations had not yet been addressed. A short time later, Henry developed a system of his own, which included 1,024 primary classifications. Within a year, the Governor-General signed a resolution directing that fingerprinting was to be the official method of identifying criminals in British India. Alphonse Bertillon. In 1902, Alphonse Bertillon, the director of the Bureau of Identification of the Paris Police, is responsible for the first criminal identification of a fingerprint without a known suspect. A print taken from the scene of a homicide was compared against the criminal fingerprints already on a file, and a match was made, marking another milestone in law enforcement technology. Meanwhile, the New York Civil Service Commission, spearheaded by Dr. Henry P. DeForest, institutes testing of the first systematic use of fingerprints in the United States. So Alphonse Bertillon is also known as the father of personal identification. Alphonse Bertillon devised a system of classification known as anthropometry, or the Bertillon system, using measurements of parts of the body. Bertillon's system included measurements such as head, length, head width, length of the middle finger, length of the left foot, and the length of the forearm, from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. So here is the illustration of anthropometry. So it is the art of personal identification through body measurements. In 1990s, AFIS, or Automated Fingerprint Identification System, began widespread use around the country. This computerized system of storing and cross-referencing criminal fingerprint records would eventually become capable of searching millions of fingerprint files in minutes, revolutionizing law enforcement efforts. Fingerprint development in the Philippines. The history of fingerprints in the Philippines could be traced back in 1901, as certain Jones, who taught fingerprint in the Philippines Constabulary, had introduced fingerprints in the Philippines. However, the first Filipino fingerprint technician was Generoso Reyes, who was employed in the Philippine Constabulary. In year 1927, Captain Thomas Dogan of New York Police and Flaviano Guerrero of FBI Washington gave the first examination in fingerprint, and Agustin Patricio of the Philippines topped the examination. So, si Mr. Jones first taught fingerprint in the Philippines. And in 1968, the Bureau of Prisons, so under the carpeta, so a fingerprint was used. So in Rosa Reyes, the first Filipino fingerprint technician employed by PC, or the Philippine Constabulary, and Isabela Bernales, the first Filipino fingerprint technician. So Isabela Bernales was the first Filipino fingerprint technician under Florida Education Institute, now Philippine College of Criminology, was the first government-recognized school to teach the science of fingerprint and other policies. The first conviction in the Philippine court through the use of fingerprint as evidence was the case of People of the Philippines versus Medina. So Medina was convicted of the crime of robbery. Lucila Lalo, the first chop-chop lady who was identified through fingerprint. So the three dogmatic principle of fingerprint. So as you have seen, so there is an individual characteristic as number 1, remain unchanged number 2, and unique patterns number 3. So fingerprints are governed by three dogmatic principles which are recognized judicially by courts all over the world. These principles are based on facts. So first is the principle of individuality. Under principle of individuality, no two persons have the same fingerprint patterns. Some mathematicians, however, did not omit the possibility that two persons will be having the same fingerprints pattern to a ratio of 1:64 billion. No two fingerprints of different persons of the ordinary ring finger of the same person have ever been found to be identical in all respects. A fingerprint is an individual characteristic, and as yet, no two prints have been found to possess identical range characteristics. In the 90 years since fingerprinting was generally introduced, out of the million of sets of prints that have been taken, no two individuals have been found to have the same fingerprints. Even identical twin brothers through fingerprint comparison can be identified as two different people, as has been shown by an investigation in 1903 made upon two men who look exactly alike per prison records in the U.S. Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. Next is the principle of permanency. It explains that fingerprints of every individual will remain unchangeable until one loses his life and decomposed. Fingerprints started to develop at third embryonic period of the fetal life. This principle is sometimes called as principle of a womb to a tomb. Fingerprinting is a method of identification of an individual through the use of the impressions made by the ridge formation found in the terminal part of the fingers. Every human being carries with him from his cradle to his grave a certain physical marks which do not change their characters, by which he can always be identified, and that without a shade of doubt or question. These marks are his signature, and this autograph cannot be counterfeited, nor can be disguised it or hide it away. This signature is each man's very own. There is no duplicate of it among the swarming populations of the globe. This autograph consists of the delicate line or corrugations with which nature marks the insides of the hands and soles of the feet. According to study, fingerprint will start to develop during third or fourth month of fetal life of a person and continue to exist until one will decompose due to death. Fingerprinting as a means of personal identification is a positive science. It cannot be forged and cannot be easily obliterated. Several known criminals, however, have tried to efface their fingerprint to cancel their identities, either by burning them with acid or surgically removing them, but both were in vain. A fingerprint will remain unchanged during an individual's lifetime. The papillary ridges are immutable, perennial, or individual from the beginning of the third month of the embryonic period until the decomposition sets in after death. The ridges on the grasping surfaces of hands and on the soles of the feet are present at birth, remain unchanged for life, except for size as growth occurs. They may be obscured by deep tissue damage that causes scarring, like burns, for example. However, these scars may also be useful as points of identification. And principle of infallibility. Fingerprint is reliable. It is positive science. It cannot be forged. There were, however, several persons have tried to forge their fingerprint, but to no avail. So forged fingerprints can be distinguished from genuine fingerprints. Under genuine fingerprint, ridges are lifelike. In forged fingerprint, ridges are sharp. Under genuine fingerprint, the sweet pores dotting the ridges are well defined, visible. But in forged fingerprint, sweet pores dot the ridges and are not noticeably absent. Of all the methods of identification, fingerprinting alone has proved to be both infallible and feasible. Its superiority over the older methods has been demonstrated time after time. To date, the fingerprints of no two individuals have been found to be identical. That's according to Hover. So quote for the day: a teacher who is not dogmatic is simply a teacher who is not teaching. Thank you and God bless.